Right into it. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So, my dear Krishna book student, Bhagavad-Gita students, I have prepared for you a summary of the middle 6 chapters of Bhagavad-Gita. And this entire presentation is taken directly from Prabhupada's purports in Bhagavad-Gita as it is, because every so often throughout Bhagavad-Gita, Srila Prabhupada gives a summary. So I collected all that nectar, and that is today's presentation. I beg forgiveness for my offenses, and I will try my best to recite and explain when I feel necessary. Prabhupada writes, in the first 6 chapters of Bhagavad-Gita, the living entity has been described as non-material spirit soul, capable of elevating him or herself to self-realization by different types of yogas. At the end of the 6th chapter, it is clearly stated that the steady concentration of the mind upon Krishna, or in other words, Krishna consciousness, is the highest form of all yoga. And by concentrating one's mind upon Krishna, one is able to know the absolute truth completely, but not otherwise. Impersonal Brahma Jyoti, or localized Paramatma realizations, are imperfect knowledge of the absolute truth because they are partial. Full and scientific knowledge is Krishna, and everything is revealed to the person in Krishna consciousness. In complete Krishna consciousness, one knows that Krishna is ultimate knowledge beyond any doubts. Different types of yoga are but only stepping stones on the path of Krishna consciousness. But one who takes directly to Krishna consciousness automatically knows about Brahma Jyoti and Paramatma in full. By practice of Krishna consciousness yoga, one can know everything in full, namely the absolute truth, the living entities, the material nature, and their manifestations with paraphernalia. One should therefore begin yoga practice as directed in the last verse of the 6th chapter. Yoginam api sarvesham madgatain antar atmana sradhavan bhajate yomang same yuttatamo mataha. My dear Arjuna, of all yogis, the one with great faith, who always abides in Krishna, thinks of Krishna within oneself, and renders transcendental loving service to Krishna, that yogi is the most intimately united with Krishna in yoga and is the highest of all. That is the opinion of Krishna. So concentration of the mind upon Krishna, who is the ultimate supreme, is made possible by prescribed devotional service in 9 different forms, which Shravanam is the first and most important. Lord Krishna therefore says to Arjuna in the beginning of the 7th chapter, touch Shrinu, hear from me. After all, no one can be a greater authority than Krishna. And thereby, by hearing Krishna, one receives the greatest opportunity to become a perfectly Krishna conscious person. One has to therefore learn from Krishna directly or from a pure devotee of Krishna, and not from a non-devotee upstart puffed up with so-called academic education. So in the 7th chapter of Bhagavad-Gita, the nature of Krishna consciousness is fully described. Krishna is full in all opulences, and how Krishna manifests such opulences is described here in Bhagavad-Gita. Also in this 7th chapter, 4 kinds of fortunate persons who become attached to Krishna, and 4 kinds of unfortunate persons who never take to Krishna are described in this 7th chapter. So chapter 7, Prabhupada entitles Knowledge of the Absolute. This 7th chapter has 30 verses. And personally, in my own study of Bhagavad-Gita, I have divided this 7th chapter into different sections. So the first 3 verses is all about knowing Krishna. The next 3 verses are called understanding the 2 energies of Krishna, namely the material and the spiritual. According to chapter 7, the material energy is inferior and the superior spiritual energy is superior. In verses 7 through 11, the key line is, as pearls are strung on a thread. Because Krishna said in this 7th chapter that everything is resting upon Krishna. Nothing can exist independent of Krishna. And he gave the analogy as pearls are strung on a thread. So that thread, sutra, that is Krishna. The next 3 verses is all about the insurmountable material energy. And we learned that the only way to cross over this insurmountable material energy is to surrender to Krishna. And therefore, the next set of verses, 15 through 19, is all about the surrendering process. Text 20 to 23, Krishna gives the facts regarding demigod worship. In those 4 verses, Krishna made some very harsh statements. He said, first of all, that those who worship demigods for material benefit, they are called less intelligent. Krishna also said that whatever benediction the demigod gives is limited and temporary. Why? Because it is a material benediction. Anything material has to be, by definition, limited and temporary. But for me, the most amazing line in those 4 verses, Mayaiva vihitan hitan. Krishna then said, to sort of wrap up the whole concept, that you may approach a demigod for some material benefit, but Krishna says, that demigod is not independent of me. Unless I sanction it, it is not going to happen. So that's why throughout Bhagavad-Gita, Krishna is called the ultimate controller, the ultimate God. Because Krishna is in the heart of all the demigods, including Lord Shiva, who is Mahadev, the topmost. But even he meditates upon Krishna or Ram in his heart. So Krishna said, you're approaching a demigod for some material benediction, but try to understand, unless I sanction in the heart of that demigod, it's not going to work. And then the final portion of the 7th chapter is all about who can and who cannot know God. Prabhupada continues. This 7th chapter particularly explains how one can become a fully Krishna conscious person. The beginning of Krishna consciousness is association of persons who are Krishna conscious. Such association is spiritual and puts one directly in touch with the Supreme Lord. And by Krishna's grace, one can understand Krishna to be the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So, by that statement, we can conclude, because the question sometimes arises, why one person is attracted to Krishna and another one is not attracted to Krishna. One person surrenders to Krishna. Yes, you need Krishna's grace. You need Krishna's blessing. There is no material formula. No, you need Krishna's blessing. And you can get Krishna's blessing in two ways. Directly from Krishna, or even more easily by coming in contact with Krishna's representative. As in my case, I had no training in Hinduism or Vedic culture. I come from Malaysia, Yavana background. But because I came in contact with a pure devotee of Krishna who became my spiritual master, who accepted me in April of 1974 as his disciple, by his contact, by his association, by his words, by his example, now I have received the grace of Krishna. So these are the two ways. Directly from Krishna, but much more tangible and practical, is the blessing of a pure devotee of Krishna. Prabhupada continues, at the same time, one can really understand two things: the constitutional position of the living entity, which is to serve, and how the living entity forgets Krishna and becomes entangled in material activities. Yes, this forgetfulness of Krishna, this is the beginning of all suffering. We are taught by Lord Chaitanya what is the ultimate regulative principle, what is the topmost commandment. And Lord Chaitanya instructed Sanatana Goswami, quoting from the Puranas, that you should always remember Krishna and never forget him. And of the two, never forgetting Krishna is more important than always remembering. So, we will never forget Krishna if we constantly engage in his service, chant Krishna's name every day, and we stay in the association of devotees. By gradual development of Krishna consciousness in good association, the living entity can understand that it is only due to forgetfulness of Krishna that one has become conditioned by the laws of material nature. So, obviously, the opposite has to be true. If you want to become unconditioned, then simply remember Krishna and never forget him. Prabhupada continues, one can also understand that this human form of life is an opportunity to regain Krishna consciousness. That, my friends, is very, very important. Regain. In other words, as Prabhupada writes so many times in his other books, that originally everyone is Krishna conscious. Otherwise, why would he use the word regain? Regain means something was lost and now you've obtained it again. So this one sentence puts to rest and immediately confirms, originally we were with Krishna, originally we were in Krishna consciousness, but we gave up our service, we forgot our constitutional position, as eternal servant of Krishna, and as a result, we are here in this material world. This human form of life should be fully utilized to attain the causeless mercy of the Supreme Lord Krishna. In this 7th chapter, many subjects are discussed. Number 1, the man in distress. Number 2, the inquisitive man. 3, the man in want of material necessities. 4, knowledge of Brahman. 5, knowledge of Paramatma. 6, liberation from birth, death, and diseases. And number 7, worship of the Supreme Lord. However, one who is actually elevated in Krishna consciousness does not care for the different processes. He or she simply directly engages in activities of Krishna consciousness, which Prabhupada already mentioned. There are 9. You're doing the most important one right now, hearing. Everything begins from hearing, and thereby factually attains one's constitutional position as an eternal servitor of Lord Krishna. In such a situation, one takes pleasure in hearing and glorifying the Supreme Lord in pure devotional service. So this is what we're striving for. The stage where we take actual pleasure in hearing and glorifying the Supreme Lord. One is thus convinced that by doing so, all of one's objectives will be fulfilled. This determined Shraddha, or faith, is called Dridha Vrata, and it is the beginning of Bhakti Yoga, or transcendental loving service. And that is the verdict of all the Vedas. The 7th chapter of Bhagavad-Gita is the substance of that conviction. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So the 8th chapter contains 28 verses. Prabhupada entitles it Attaining the Supreme. So, what is the Supreme? Well, that depends on your perspective. Because there are 3 kinds of transcendentalists: the speculator, the meditative yogi, and the devotee. But all 3 of them have a different conception of the Supreme. For the mental speculator, the jnani, his objective, or what he considers supreme, is the impersonal Brahman, the impersonal Brahmajyoti. Does not go any further than that. For the meditative yogi, the supreme is Krishna in the heart, Paramatma, with 4 hands. But for the bhakta, for the devotee, the supreme is Krishna, Bhagavan. The supreme, or for those who are devotees of Ramachandra, Lord Ram is the supreme. Any personality of Godhead can be considered supreme. Of course, those who follow Lord Chaitanya, they say the supreme of the supremes is Bhagavan Sri Krishna Shyama Sundara Yashodanandana. That is the supreme of all the supremes. So this 8th chapter, I personally have analyzed that verses 1 through 7, Arjuna asks Krishna 8 questions, and Krishna answers Arjuna's 8 questions. And the most important question that Arjuna asks is, how can those know you at the time of death? Because the time of death is the most crucial point of a person's life. Why? Because as Krishna says in this beginning section of the 8th chapter, whatever you are thinking of at the time of death will determine your next life. And you all know the classic story of Bharat, who at the end of his life, at that critical motion, was thinking of a small little deer. Although he had gotten this close, he was almost at perfection. Because he became attached to the deer, at the time of death, he didn't remember Krishna. He remembered the deer, so Krishna had to punish him. And he took one birth as a deer with consciousness of his mistake. And then in his next life, he became Jada Bharat and achieved self-realization. So this first section of chapter 8, the important question. So, as devotees, we understand this very clearly, that I must, at the time of death, remember Krishna. And that is why we practice remembering Krishna while we're healthy, while we're alive. We're simply practicing. That's what we're doing. Just like an athlete. Before going to the big game all week, the athlete is practicing. That is called the sadhana, the practice. We do that. So we are doing the chanting. We are doing the worshiping. We are studying Bhagavad-Gita. Why? It's all part of the practice, so that when the final exam comes, the moment of death, we will easily pass the test and remember Krishna. That's why the 7th verse of this 8th chapter, Krishna tells Arjuna, you have to execute your prescribed duty. In this case, Arjuna was on the battlefield, so his prescribed duty was to fight. But Krishna says, not only fight, but think of me. So the same applies for us, because Arjuna is just the target. Bhagavad-Gita is for Arjuna, yes, but it's also for us, the citizens of Kali Yuga. So we're not fighting on a battlefield, but we are fighting illusion. We are fighting ignorance. We are fighting gross materialism. We are fighting atheism. We are fighting Maya. And how do you fight? By chanting and hearing the holy name, fame, form, pastimes, instructions, qualities of Krishna. Verses 8 through 15 are different processes for attaining the Supreme. In verses 16 through 22, Krishna compares again the two natures, the material energy and the spiritual energy. And the final section of the 8th chapter is entitled, The Two Ways of Passing Away from This World, one in light and one in darkness. But if you are paying close attention to the class, it was also mentioned that as devotees, we don't have to worry about a particular material good or bad situation from passing away from this world. Because we are always engaged in spiritual, devotional activities, then it doesn't matter how we leave this world, when we leave this world, doesn't matter. Because this practice of always remembering Krishna and never forgetting Him, that guarantees complete success if you can pass the final exam at the time of death. So the final verse of chapter 8 is very instructive, and Prabhupada's comments on the final verse of chapter 8 is an excellent summary. So here's the verse. Vedeshu yagyeshu tapaksu chaiva dhaneshu yat punya phalang pratishtam atyeti tatsarvam idang viditva yogi parang sthanam upaiti chadyam. The Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna, says, A person who accepts the path of devotional service is not bereft of the results derived from studying the Vedas, performing austere sacrifices, giving charity, or pursuing philosophical and fruitive activities. Simply by performing devotional service, one attains all of these, and at the end, one reaches the supreme eternal abode. And again, for devotees, the supreme eternal abode is known as Vaikuntha. Either you will achieve one of the planets of Krishna's personal expansions, such as Ram, Nrsimha, Varaha, Kurma, Vamana, so many personalities of Godhead in the Vaikuntha world with their 4 arms manifesting the different symbols. Or if you are pure devotee of Krishna, the supreme eternal abode is known as Krishna Loka, which has 4 different areas. It has Dwaraka, it has Mathura, it has Braja Vrindavan, and it also has Navadvip, where you can be simultaneously with Krishna and with Lord Chaitanya. Yes. Prabhupada writes, this verse is the summation of the 7th and 8th chapters, which particularly deal with Krishna consciousness and devotional service. One has to study the Vedas under the guidance of a spiritual master and undergo many austerities and penances while living under the Guru's care. A brahmachari has to live in the home of the spiritual master just like a servant, and the brahmachari must beg alms from door to door and bring them to the spiritual master. The brahmachari takes food only under the master's order, and if the master should neglect to call the student for food that day, the student fasts. These are some of the Vedic principles for observing brahmacharya. After the student studies the Vedas under the master for a period of 5 to 20 years, then one may become a man of perfect character. Study of the Vedas is not meant for the recreation of armchair speculators, but rather for the formation of character. After this training, the brahmachari is allowed to enter into household life and marry. And when he is a householder, he has to perform many sacrifices so that he may achieve further enlightenment. He must also give charity according to the country, time, and candidate, discriminating among charity in goodness, in passion, and ignorance, as described later towards the end of Bhagavad-Gita. Then, after retiring from household life, one accepts the order of vanaprastha and undergoes severe penances, living in forests, dressing with tree bark, not shaving, etc. By carrying out the orders of brahmacharya, householder life, vanaprastha, and finally sannyas, one becomes elevated to the perfectional stage of life. However, some are then elevated to the heavenly planets, and when they become even more advanced, later they are liberated in the spiritual sky, either in the impersonal Brahma Jyoti, or in the Vaikuntha planets or Krishna Loka. This is the path outlined by Vedic literature. But the beauty of Krishna consciousness, however, is that by one stroke, by engaging in devotional service in 9 different ways, one can surpass all the rituals of the different orders of life. So, those 9 processes: Sravana Kirtana, Smarana Vandana, Pada Sevana, Dasyare, Pujana Sakijana, Atmanivedana. So first there's hearing, and when you have heard and heard and heard and heard, then you come to the stage of Kirtanam, chanting, describing, preaching, glorifying. Then the third process, always remembering Krishna's name, fame, form, pastimes, entourage, instructions, qualities. Then there is the stage of worshiping Krishna in his deity form. Higher than that is doing direct service to Krishna's lotus feet. There is also praying. Then the 2 higher stages, becoming Krishna's friend, and the ultimate stage, surrendering everything to Krishna. And so the words idang viditva indicate that one should understand the instructions given by Sri Krishna in this 8th chapter and the 7th chapter of Bhagavad-Gita. One should try to understand these chapters not by scholarship or mental speculation, but by hearing them in the association with devotees. So that is what you are doing in your Bhagavad-Gita class that you have with Srinam Radha. You are associating with each other, hearing the glories of Bhagavad-Gita. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Chapters 7 through 12 are the essence of Bhagavad-Gita. The first 6 and the last 6 chapters are like coverings of the middle 6 chapters, which are especially protected by Lord Krishna. So, as I mentioned, Prabhupada is giving you the summary all along. So this sentence is very instructive, for me at least, that yes, these middle 6 chapters, these are the essence. So these middle 6 chapters should be studied and learned, and memorized, and especially internalized or put into practice. Prabhupada continues, if one is fortunate enough to understand Bhagavad-Gita, especially these middle 6 chapters, in the association of devotees, then one's life at once becomes glorified beyond all penances, sacrifices, charities, speculations, etc. For one can achieve all the results of these activities simply by engaging in the 9 different processes of Krishna consciousness. One who has a little faith in Bhagavad-Gita should learn Bhagavad-Gita from a devotee, because Krishna said in the beginning of the 4th chapter, Sa evayang mayatedya yoga prokta puratanaha bhaktosi me sakacheti rahasyang hitad uttamam. So this third line, this line should be memorized. Bhaktosi me sakacheti. Why did Krishna select Arjuna to receive Bhagavad-Gita? Here is the answer. Bhakta Sakha. Arjuna's 2 qualifications was not that he was Pakka Brahmana. Not that he knew Sanskrit. Not that he was this, that. No. These are the 2 qualifications Krishna is looking for that gives one access. One must be a devotee, a bhakta, and one must have feelings of friendship towards Lord Krishna. Bhaktosi me sakacheti. If you have those two qualifications, regardless of who and what you were or now, doesn't matter. There is no material qualification or disqualification. This is all that is required. Are you Krishna's devotee? Are you Krishna's friend? Bhagavad-Gita can be understood only by devotees. No one else can perfectly understand the purpose of Bhagavad-Gita. One should therefore learn Bhagavad-Gita from a devotee of Krishna and not from mental speculators. This is a sign of faith. When one searches for a devotee and finally gets a devotee's association, one actually begins to study and understand Bhagavad-Gita. By advancement in the association of the devotee, one is placed in devotional service, and this service dispels all one's misgivings about Krishna or God and Krishna's activities, forms, pastimes, name, and other features. And after these misgivings have been perfectly cleared away, then one becomes fixed in one's study of Bhagavad-Gita. Then one relishes the study of Bhagavad-Gita and attains the state of feeling always Krishna conscious. So here, this sentence is very instructive. You can tell for yourself. You don't need somebody's certificate or someone else's validation. No. If you relish studying Bhagavad-Gita, then you know you have made some advancement. And if you can attain this state of always feeling Krishna conscious, then you know you have made some advancement. So this is one thing that I like about Krishna consciousness. Because in the 9th chapter, there is one line, Pratyakshabagamam dharmyam. I love this line, Pratyakshabagamam, meaning, again, you don't need anyone else's approval. No. If you actually are experiencing Krishna consciousness, you'll know in yourself. Just like sometimes I have eaten in the home of Srinam Radha. So many times I can't count. So she cooks very nicely for Krishna, especially when she makes that pongal, especially when she makes South Indian. Very, very nice. So I've eaten so many times, and being a perfect disciple and perfect host, she'll always say, "Oh, Gurudev, do you want more? Do you?" And I have to go, no more. Why? Because she doesn't know. I know within myself I'm full. She doesn't know. Her goal is to feed me up to the neck. But especially now at this age, I have to be careful. So I know. She doesn't. Nobody knows. Oh, I'm full. I am santosh. I am satisfied. So the same way, you will know in yourself how you are Krishna conscious. You'll know it. Nobody else may know, but you'll know. Because you'll, as we will learn in the 18th chapter, na sochati na kankshati. You'll have nothing to lament, and you'll feel so satisfied. You don't need anything. You just need your mala. You just need your Bhagavad-Gita, and you're happy, happy, happy. Let's continue. In the advanced stage, one falls completely in love with Krishna. So here's another stage. You know when you love someone. You know when you are attracted to someone. You know when you don't want to associate with someone because they're a coconut, a rascal. No, you know. So, When you completely fall in love with Krishna, you will know, you'll feel it, you'll experience. This highest perfectional stage of life enables the devotee to be transferred to Krishna's abode in the spiritual sky, which is known as Goloka Vrindavana, where the devotee becomes eternally happy. The devotees are constantly engaged in the Supreme Lord's service. The Lord understands the mentality and sincerity of a particular living entity who is engaged in Krishna consciousness. And Krishna gives him or her the intelligence to understand the science of Krishna in the association of devotees. So here, Prabhupada is hinting at something which we will study in the 10th chapter. Discussion of Krishna is very potent, virya. And if a fortunate person has such association and tries to assimilate the knowledge, then one will surely make advancement towards spiritual realization. In order to encourage Arjuna to higher and higher elevation in Krishna's potent service, Krishna describes in the 9th chapters matters more confidential than any he has already disclosed. The very beginning of Bhagavad-Gita, the 1st chapter, is more or less an introduction to the rest of the book. And in the 2nd and 3rd chapters, the spiritual knowledge is described as confidential. Topics discussed in the 7th and 8th chapters, which are specifically related to devotional service, and because they bring enlightenment in Krishna consciousness, they are called more confidential. But the matters which are described in the 9th chapter deal with unalloyed, pure devotion. Therefore, this 9th chapter is called most confidential. One who is situated in the most confidential knowledge of Krishna is naturally transcendental. He or she, therefore, has no material pangs, even though one might be in the material world. In Rupa Goswami's Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, it is said that one who has a sincere desire to render loving service to the Supreme Lord is situated in the conditional state of material existence. Still, he or she is to be considered liberated. That, my friends, is so important. If you have this desire to serve Krishna, according to Rupa Goswami, you are already to be considered liberated, as long as you have that sincere desire to hear, chant, remember, pray, and serve Krishna. And so similarly, we shall find in the 10th chapter of Bhagavad-Gita that anyone who is engaged in that way is a liberated person. In the 7th chapter, we have already discussed the opulent potency of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, his different energies, the inferior and superior natures, and all of this material manifestation. In chapter 9, the glories of Lord Krishna are delineated. So, chapter 9 has 34 verses. And of course, Prabhupada entitles it, The Most Confidential Knowledge. And the first 3 verses I have subtitled, The Most Confidential Knowledge. And here's Prabhupada's purport, summarizing. This 9th chapter of Bhagavad-Gita is called the King of Education because it is the essence of all doctrines and philosophies explained before. Among the principal philosophers in India are Gautama, Kanada, atheist Kapila, Yagyavalkya, Shandilya, and Vaishvanara. And finally, there is Vyasadeva, the author of the Vedanta Sutra. And so there is no dearth of knowledge in the field of philosophy or transcendental knowledge. Now the Lord says that this 9th chapter is the king of all such knowledge, the essence of all knowledge, which can be derived from the study of the Vedas and different kinds of philosophy. So I don't know if you studied it, but Prabhupada's introduction to Bhagavad-Gita is also very, very helpful to understanding Bhagavad-Gita. So if you have not studied that, if you have not read that, I urge you, please read the entire, it's a very long dissertation, but Prabhupada's introduction to the Bhagavad-Gita is so instructive. It is the most confidential because confidential or transcendental knowledge involves understanding the difference between the soul and the body. And the king of all confidential knowledge culminates in devotional service. The next section of chapter 9, verses 4 through 10, I entitle Simultaneously One and Different. That is the specific philosophy that was instructed by Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, Achitya Veda Abeda Tattva, that everything is inconceivably, simultaneously one and at the same time different from Krishna. Everything, as I said much earlier, everything rests on Krishna. There's nothing independent of Krishna. So in one sense, everything is Krishna, and at the same time, everything is not Krishna. That is what we mean by simultaneously one and different. Prabhupada writes, the Bhagavad-Gita, especially from the 2nd chapter on, stresses the importance of the soul. In the very beginning, Krishna says that the body is perishable and the soul is imperishable. Antavanta ime deha nityas yukta shariranaha. So that is confidential knowledge, simply knowing that the spirit soul is different from the body and that its nature is immutable or unchangeable, indestructible, and eternal. But that does not give any positive information about the soul. Sometimes people are under the impression that the soul is different from the body and that when the body is finished or one is liberated from the body, the soul remains in a void and becomes impersonal. But actually, according to Bhagavad-Gita, that is not the truth. How can the soul, which is so active within this dead body, all of a sudden become inactive after being liberated from the body? No. The soul is always active. If the soul is eternal, then the soul is eternally active. And the soul's activities in the spiritual kingdom are the most confidential part of all spiritual knowledge. These activities of the spirit soul are therefore indicated herein as constituting the king of all knowledge, the most confidential part of all knowledge. The remainder of this 9th chapter, verses 11 through 15, is about the Duratma and the Mahatma and those in between. Verses 16 through 19, Krishna explains who and what he is. Verses 20 and 21, what happens to the worshippers of the Vedas. In verses 22 through 27, different kinds of worship are explained. And then the final section of the 9th chapter is the glories of Krishna's devotees. So Prabhupada writes, the 7th and 8th chapters of Bhagavad-Gita have explained pure devotional service to the Lord, which is free from speculative knowledge, mystic yoga, and fruitive activities. Those who are not purely sanctified may be attracted by different features of the Lord, like impersonal Brahmajyoti and localized Paramatma. But a pure devotee directly takes to the service of the Supreme Lord. There is a beautiful poem about Krishna in which it is clearly stated that any person who is engaged in the worship of demigods has to be seen as being most unintelligent and cannot achieve at any time the supreme award of Krishna. Now, in the beginning, the devotee may sometimes fall from the standard, but still he or she should be considered superior to all other philosophers and yogis. One who always engages in Krishna consciousness should be understood to be a perfectly saintly person, and one's accidental, non-devotional activities will thus diminish, and he or she will be situated without any doubt in complete perfection very soon. The pure devotee, however, has no actual chance to fall down because the Supreme Godhead personally takes care of his pure devotees. Therefore, the intelligent person should directly take to the process of Krishna consciousness and happily live in this material world. He or she will eventually receive the supreme award of Krishna.